What do you do when you owe your life to an enemy whose name you never knew, whose voice you never heard, whose story you were ordered never to tell? You go home, you build a life, you raise a family, you grow old. But the memories never stop hunting you. Decades pass, but the war never really leaves. Some nights you're back over Germany, trapped inside a crippled bomber with nowhere to run. A shattered B-17, one gunner dead in the tail, the surviving crew wounded, freezing and struggling to stay conscious, and a Luftwaffe ace closing in behind them, ordered to finish the job. Instead, he lowered his guns. An act of mercy so extraordinary that, had his superiors discovered it, Franz Stigler could have faced a military trial and possibly execution. Still, he chose mercy. After returning to England in December 1943, Brown later recalled that intelligence officers instructed him never to speak about what had happened. Allied commanders feared that stories of compassion from German fighter pilots could undermine wartime morale. The enemy was the enemy, and this story was never meant to be told. So Charlie stayed silent. He buried the memory deep inside himself, carrying the image of that unknown German pilot like a ghost. Then came 1986. At the gathering of the Eagles Combat Pilot Reunion at Maxwell Air Force Base, Alabama, someone asked him a simple question: "What was your most memorable mission?" For the first time in more than 40 years, Charlie told the story. The questions came immediately. Who was he? Did he survive the war? Why haven't you tried to find him? Charlie had no answers. But if he was ever going to find the man who had saved his life, he first had to retrace the nightmare from the very beginning. Back to the frozen sky over Germany. December 20th, 1943, 5 days before Christmas. 21-year-old Second Lieutenant Charlie Brown gripped the controls of a B-17F flying fortress named Olde Pub. It was his first combat mission as an aircraft commander with the 527th Bomb Squadron. Nearly 27,000 feet above the German city of Bremen, he was flying into one of the Reich's most heavily defended industrial centers. Then, the flak hit. The blast tore through the bomber's nose, ripping it open. Air approaching -60 degrees Celsius roared into the aircraft, turning the cockpit into an Arctic wind tunnel. Engine number 2 was knocked out. Engine number 4 was heavily damaged and began overspeeding, forcing Charlie to throttle it back before it tore itself from the wing. Despite the catastrophic damage, Charlie somehow kept the crippled bomber steady through the bombing run, until the bomb bay doors opened and the bombs were released on the target. But when the formation turned for home, Olde Pub could no longer keep pace. With 2 engines crippled and another losing power, the battered B-17 began to fall behind. One by one, the other American bombers disappeared into the clouds, leaving Charlie and his crew completely alone in the skies over Nazi Germany. Within minutes, roughly a dozen German fighters descended upon the defenseless straggler. For 10 relentless minutes, enemy fighters made pass after pass, tearing the bomber apart. A cannon shell struck engine number 3, reducing it to half power. Half the rudder was blown away, control cables were damaged, and a direct hit devastated the radio compartment. Inside the aircraft, the temperature plunged. Much of the electrical system failed, and most of the defensive machine guns became unusable in the freezing air. Of the bomber's 11 guns, only 2 were still capable of firing. Tail gunner Hugh Eckenrode took a direct cannon hit to his position and was killed instantly. Blood and freezing chaos filled the fuselage. Waist gunner Alex Yelasanko was struck by shrapnel and bled heavily onto the aluminum floor. Radio operator Richard Petchout was seriously wounded by shell fragments, while ball turret gunner Samuel Blackie Blackford lost power to his electrically heated suit, suffering severe frostbite in his feet. Flight engineer Bertrand Frenchy Coulomb moved through the shattered aircraft to help the wounded crew. When the crew tried to treat the wounded, they discovered that the morphine syrettes had frozen solid. Charlie himself had been wounded in the shoulder, but he remained at the controls. Then the aircraft's central oxygen system was ruptured. Starved of oxygen at nearly 27,000 feet, Charlie began losing consciousness. His vision darkened, and his hands slipped from the control yoke. Uncontrolled, the shattered B-17 rolled onto its wing and entered a violent spiral dive, falling thousands of feet toward the German countryside. Crewmen were losing consciousness. The tail gunner was dead, the engines were damaged, and the bomber seemed to be tearing itself apart during the descent. Then, something extraordinary happened. As the plane plunged through the lower clouds into denser, oxygen-rich air, through the haze of hypoxia, he saw the ground rushing toward him. Grabbing the control yoke, Charlie pulled back with everything he had. The B-17 shuddered violently and leveled out, only a few hundred feet above the ground, near the German city of Oldenburg. Against all odds, the Olde Pub was still flying. But as Charlie struggled to keep the crippled bomber in the air, he had no idea that at an airfield below, a German fighter pilot had already spotted it and was running toward his Messerschmitt Bf 109. That pilot was none other than Franz Stigler. Just minutes earlier, Stigler had returned from combat after intercepting the American bomber stream. He had already shot down 2 B-17 flying fortresses that day, and his own Messerschmitt still bore the scars of battle as ground crews hurriedly refueled and rearmed it. At 28 years old, Stigler was already one of the Luftwaffe's most respected fighter aces. A veteran of the North African campaign, he had flown under the legendary Hans-Joachim Marseille and had been credited with 28 aerial victories. One more American heavy bomber would almost certainly earn him the Knight's Cross, Nazi Germany's highest award for battlefield valor. Without hesitation, he climbed into his Messerschmitt Bf 109, pushed the throttle forward, and thundered into the winter sky. To Stigler, the crippled B-17 struggling across the German countryside looked like an easy kill. Closing in from behind, Stigler waited for the tail guns to swing toward him. They never moved. He eased closer. The tail gunner was slumped, motionless, in his shattered position. The bomber had been ripped apart. Through the gaping holes in its fuselage, Stigler could see the crew, desperately trying to save their wounded. In that instant, he remembered the words of his former commander, Gustav Rödel. "If I ever hear of one of you shooting a man in a parachute, I'll shoot you myself." To Stigler, firing on this helpless bomber would have been no different. What he saw was no longer another aircraft to shoot down. He saw men. Instead of firing, Stigler pulled alongside the crippled bomber. Charlie looked through the cockpit window and froze. The German fighter was so close that he could see the pilot staring directly at him. Charlie closed his eyes and shook his head, convinced the sight had to be a hallucination. When he opened them again, the fighter was still there. Stigler knew the shattered B-17 was far too badly damaged to survive the long, freezing flight across the North Sea. Mouthing words drowned out by the roar of the engines. He pointed urgently toward the ground. He tried to convince Charlie to land at a nearby German airfield or alter course to neutral Sweden, where his dying and wounded crew could receive immediate medical attention. Inside the roaring cockpit, Charlie couldn't hear a word. The idea that an enemy fighter pilot was trying to save them was so unthinkable that he assumed he was being ordered to surrender. Charlie refused to yield. Despite the overwhelming odds, he kept Ye Olde Pub locked on its heading toward England. He didn't dare order his gunners to aim at the Messerschmitt. He knew any aggressive movement could force the German pilot's hand. He simply held his course, realizing the American pilot was determined to fly home or die trying. Stigler knew what awaited them. The moment the B-17 reached the German coastline, it would almost certainly come under fire from German coastal flak batteries. So Stigler made his choice. He tucked his Messerschmitt tightly alongside the B-17 and escorted the crippled bomber across the German coastline, remaining so close that the two aircraft could appear to be flying together. Enemy and target crossed the coastline and headed out over the freezing North Sea. Past the reach of the coastal guns, Stigler knew his fuel was running low. He pulled alongside the cockpit one final time, looked Charlie Brown in the eye, and raised his hand in a crisp salute. Then Franz Stigler banked away into the clouds. For nearly 2 agonizing hours, Charlie wrestled the shattered ye olde pub across the North Sea. Against all odds, he brought the battered flying fortress safely down at the Royal Air Force Station at Seething, Norfolk, England. 1986. The memories were as vivid as ever. The reunion had been the trigger. Charlie began searching. For years he combed through US military records, searched Luftwaffe archives, and followed every lead he could find. Every trail ended the same way. Silence. One dead end after another. Finally, in late 1989, Charlie published a letter in a newsletter for former combat pilots. One last message, sent out into the world. At last, in early 1990, the answer came from British Columbia. Franz Stigler had moved to Canada after the war. Charlie called the number in the letter. When Franz answered, Charlie asked the questions only one German pilot could have answered. Every answer confirmed what Charlie had hoped for all those years. Decades of grief and gratitude came rushing back. His voice trembling, Charlie whispered, "My God, it's you." Months later, they met face to face in the lobby of a Florida hotel. They embraced, not as former enemies, but as lifelong friends. Until their deaths in 2008, just 8 months apart, Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler remained the closest of friends.